The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' perfectly trimmed lawn as he stepped out onto his front porch. At 93 years old, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his daily routine never changed. He adjusted his veteran's cap, which proudly displayed his World War II service pins, and carefully made his way down the 3 wooden steps of his small suburban home. Every morning for the past 30 years, Harold had followed the same schedule. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., make his coffee just the way Martha, his late wife, had taught him, and prepare for his morning walk to the Veterans Memorial Park 6 blocks away. The neighbors along Cedar Street had grown used to seeing the elderly veteran, always dressed in his pressed khaki pants and clean white shirt, making his way down the sidewalk with careful, measured steps. Today was Tuesday, and like every Tuesday, Harold carried his small gardening bag. Inside were his trusted pruning shears, a small watering can, and fresh flowers to place at the memorial. The tools might have seemed heavy for someone his age, but Harold wouldn't hear of leaving them behind. A soldier never abandons his equipment. He would tell anyone who suggested he take it easier. As he walked, Harold nodded to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watering her roses. She had moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago and always made sure to wave to him. Her young son, Tommy, was fascinated by Harold's war stories and often asked about the shiny medals the old veteran sometimes wore on special occasions. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," Tommy called out from behind the fence. "Are you going to tell me about the tanks today?" Harold smiled, his weathered face crinkling around the eyes. "Maybe later, young man. First, I have my duties to attend to." The Veterans Memorial Park was Harold's pride and joy. He had helped establish it back in 1990, working with the city council to create a peaceful place where veterans could remember their fallen comrades. The centerpiece was a beautiful granite monument engraved with the names of local soldiers who had given their lives for their country. Around it, carefully maintained flower beds bloomed in patriotic colors of red, white, and blue. As Harold approached the park entrance, he noticed something was different. The usual morning quiet was broken by distant rumbling sounds. He paused, his hand tightening slightly around his walking stick. The sound reminded him of the motorcycles they had used during the war, but these were louder, more aggressive. Rounding the corner, Harold's heart sank a little. There, scattered around the memorial's parking lot, were 5 large motorcycles. Their chrome surfaces gleamed in the morning sun, and Harold could smell the lingering exhaust in the air. Near the bikes, a group of leather-clad men stood talking and laughing, their voices carrying across the usually peaceful park. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, noticed Harold and nudged his companions. The laughter died down, replaced by knowing smirks. Harold straightened his back, just as he had done countless times during his military service, and continued his walk toward the memorial. Well, look who's here, boys," the bearded man called out. "It's the park keeper." Harold ignored them, focusing instead on his destination. He had faced German artillery in the war. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a few loud motorcycles. Reaching the memorial, he set down his gardening bag and began his usual routine. First, he stood at attention and saluted the monument, holding the position for a full minute as he did every morning. Behind him, he could hear snickers and whispered comments, but he paid them no mind. This was sacred ground to him, and he would treat it as such. Opening his bag, Harold took out the fresh flowers and began replacing the ones that had wilted in the summer heat. As he worked, Harold's mind drifted to his old unit, remembering faces of friends long gone. He thought about young Tommy and his fascination with war stories, and how different the reality had been from the glamorous tales children imagined. The rumbling of motorcycle engines starting up pulled him from his thoughts, and he watched as the group rode away, their machines echoing through the peaceful morning. Little did Harold know that this was just the beginning of a challenge that would test his courage in ways he hadn't experienced since the war. But for now, he continued his work, determined to maintain the dignity of this special place, just as he had promised his fallen comrades he would. 3 weeks had passed since the bikers first appeared at the Veterans Memorial Park, and things were only getting worse. Harold Matthews noticed the changes immediately. Cigarette butts littered the ground around the memorial, empty beer cans appeared in the flower beds, and the peaceful atmosphere he had cherished for decades was shattered by the constant roar of motorcycles. On this particular morning, Harold arrived at the park to find Snake, the bearded leader of the motorcycle group, sitting on the memorial's low wall. 4 other bikers lounged nearby, their heavy boots scraping against the polished granite that Harold had helped install 30 years ago. "Hey, look who's back!" Snake called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "It's the old-timer. Don't you ever take a day off, Gramps." Harold's hands tightened around his walking stick, but his face remained calm. He had learned during the war that showing fear or anger only encouraged bullies. Instead, he began his usual routine, though his heart beat faster than normal. "You know," Snake continued, standing up and walking toward Harold, "my boys and I have been wondering something. What's so special about this chunk of rock anyway?" He kicked a small stone, sending it skittering across the memorial's base. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, Harold spoke directly to them. His voice was quiet but firm. "Young man, every name on this memorial represents someone who died so you could have the freedom to stand here and mock their sacrifice." The other bikers fell silent, but Snake just laughed. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough guy. Hey boys, the old-timer thinks he can lecture us." He moved closer to Harold, towering over him. "Listen, old man, times have changed. Nobody cares about your ancient war stories anymore." Mrs. Rodriguez, who was walking her dog nearby, saw what was happening and quickly pulled out her phone. Harold could hear her calling the police, but he knew from experience they wouldn't arrive in time to help. Snake noticed the call too. He smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "We'll be gone before the cops show up, but don't worry, we'll be back tomorrow. This is our territory now." As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, one of them, younger than the others, deliberately rode his bike through Harold's carefully tended flower bed, crushing the red and white petunias he had planted just last week. The roar of engines filled the air as they departed, leaving behind the acrid smell of exhaust and torn flowers. Harold stood there for a long moment, looking at the damaged garden. Mrs. Rodriguez hurried over, her small dog yapping at her heels. "Mr. Matthews, are you okay? Those horrible men. I'll testify to the police about what they did." "Thank you, Maria," Harold said quietly, already bending down to assess the damage to his flowers. "But we both know they'll be gone before anyone arrives." Throughout the day, other regular park visitors stopped by. Old Joe Wilson, another World War II veteran who usually came to play chess in the park, took one look at the bikers' hangout spot and turned around. Sarah Chen, who brought her grandfather to the memorial every week, drove past without stopping. That evening, as Harold sat in his favorite armchair at home, he looked at the old photograph on his mantel. It showed him and his unit standing proud beside their military motorcycles in France, 1944. They had been young then, fearless messengers who rode through enemy territory carrying vital information. Next to that photo was one of Martha, his late wife, smiling beside their own motorcycle, a beautiful 1945 Indian Chief that still sat covered in his garage. She had loved that bike, and after she passed away 10 years ago, Harold couldn't bring himself to sell it. As darkness fell outside his window, Harold heard the distant rumble of motorcycles heading toward the park. For the first time in years, he walked to his garage and pulled the cover off Martha's old Indian Chief. The chrome was still perfect under a thin layer of dust, maintained even though it hadn't been ridden in a decade. "Well, Martha," he said softly, running his hand along the bike's seat, "I think it's time we showed these young fellows what a real motorcycle rider looks like." In that moment, as the sound of the biker's laughter echoed from the direction of his beloved memorial, Harold Matthews made a decision that would surprise everyone, especially the bikers who thought they had him figured out. The next morning started differently for Harold Matthews. Instead of his usual 6 o'clock a.m. wake-up, he was already up at 4:30, sitting in his garage with a cup of coffee. The old Indian Chief motorcycle stood before him, freshly cleaned and polished after his late-night work session. "Just like riding a bicycle," he muttered to himself, remembering what his grandson had once told him. But deep down, Harold knew motorcycles were nothing like bicycles, especially not at his age. His hands weren't as strong as they used to be, and his reflexes weren't as quick. Still, the familiar smell of leather and oil brought back memories of younger days. As he walked to the memorial park that morning, Harold saw something that made his blood boil. The bikers had been there overnight, and the damage was worse than ever before. The granite memorial stone was covered with spray paint. Empty beer bottles were scattered everywhere. But worst of all, someone had torn down the American flag and left it crumpled on the ground. Harold's hands shook as he picked up the flag. For the first time since Martha's funeral, he felt tears running down his weathered cheeks. This wasn't just about noise or disrespect anymore. This was personal. Mrs. Rodriguez came running across the street when she saw him. "Mr. Matthews, I called the police 3 times last night, but they said they couldn't do anything unless they caught them in the act." Harold carefully folded the flag with military precision, his movements deliberate and respectful. "Thank you, Maria, but I think it's time for a different approach." He spent the next hour picking up trash and trying to clean the spray paint, but most of it wouldn't come off. Other regular visitors to the park drove by, looking sad and helpless. Old Joe Wilson came by with cleaning supplies to help, but even their combined efforts couldn't erase all the damage. "You know what burns me up, Harold?" Joe said as they worked. "My grandson wanted to come here last week to learn about his great-grandfather's service, but with these hooligans around, I had to tell him no. It's not safe anymore." Harold nodded silently, remembering all the children like Tommy who used to visit, eagerly learning about their country's history. Now the park was becoming a place people avoided. Around noon, the bikers returned. Their motorcycles roared into the parking lot, and Snake's loud laugh echoed across the park. Harold and Joe watched as they settled in, pulling out beer cans despite it being barely afternoon. "Well, well," Snake called out when he spotted Harold and Joe cleaning. "The cleanup crew is here. How's that working out for you, old-timers?" One of the younger bikers laughed and tossed an empty can toward the flower bed. That was the moment something snapped inside Harold. He stood up straight, his jaw set firmly, just like in his military days. "Joe," he said quietly, "I need you to do me a favor. Go to my garage. There's a blue tarp covering something special. Bring it here." Joe looked confused but nodded. He knew that tone in Harold's voice. It was the same one he'd heard in the war when their commanders were about to do something either very brave or very foolish. While Joe was gone, Harold walked slowly back to his house. In his bedroom closet, behind his regular clothes, hung something he hadn't worn in years. His old leather jacket from his motorcycle messenger days. The leather was still soft, though a bit stiff from lack of use. His unit's patch was still sewn on the shoulder, slightly faded but proud. As he put on the jacket, Harold caught his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he saw himself as he was in 1944, young, strong, and unafraid. The years had changed him on the outside, but inside, that same courage remained. He'd heard Joe returning with the motorcycle. Through his window, Harold could see the Indian chief gleaming in the sunlight, looking almost new after his night of work. The bikers had gathered around it, pointing and talking among themselves. "Well, Martha," Harold said to the photo of his wife on the dresser, "I might be about to do something crazy. But sometimes crazy is exactly what's needed." He picked up his old motorcycle gloves and walked toward the door, ready to show these young troublemakers that they had seriously underestimated the old veteran they'd been tormenting. Harold Matthews walked toward the park with steady steps, his old leather jacket fitting him better than he expected. The bikers had gathered around his Indian chief motorcycle, which Joe had parked near the memorial. Their usual loud voices were now quiet as they examined the vintage bike. Snake was the first to notice Harold approaching. His mouth dropped open slightly at the sight of the elderly veteran in full riding gear. The other bikers turned to look, and for once, nobody laughed. "That's a 1945 Indian chief," one of the younger bikers said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "They only made a few hundred of these after the war." "How did you?" "She was my wife's," Harold replied, his voice clear and strong. "Martha rode her all through the 50s. Kept her in perfect condition, too." He ran his hand along the chrome handlebars, remembering Martha's smile when she first saw the bike. Snake crossed his arms, trying to hide his surprise. "Nice museum piece, old-timer. What's your point? You gonna sell it or something?" Harold looked directly at Snake, his blue eyes sharp and clear. "Actually, I'm here to join your motorcycle club." The silence that followed was complete. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Snake's face went through several expressions: confusion, amusement, and finally, disbelief. "You want to what?" Snake asked, laughing. "Listen, Gramps, this isn't a retirement home. We're the road warriors. We have a reputation to maintain." Harold nodded calmly. "Yes, I know. You maintain that reputation by vandalizing war memorials and disrespecting people who fought for your freedom. Very impressive. His voice carried a hint of steel that made even Snake shift uncomfortably. "Now look here," Harold continued. "I got two options. I can keep calling the police, who we all know won't do anything, or I can join your club and show you what real riding is about." He patted the Indian chief's seat. "During the war, I rode through enemy territory carrying messages that helped save hundreds of lives. Never lost a message, never crashed a bike." The youngest biker, who had been examining the motorcycle's engine, looked up with interest. "You were a motorcycle messenger in World War II. 82nd Airborne Division," Harold replied. "We rode harder and faster than anyone because lives depended on it." He pulled out an old photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it to the young biker. It showed a much younger Harold on a military motorcycle, dressed in combat gear. The photo was passed around the group. Even Snake took a look, his tough expression softening slightly as he studied it. "Okay, old man," Snake said finally, handing back the photo. "You want to join? Fine, but we have rules. Tests you have to pass. Think you can handle that at your age?" Harold smiled, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. "Son, I was handling motorcycles before your father was born. Just name your challenges." Snake grinned, but there was something different in his expression now, a mix of curiosity and maybe even a tiny bit of respect. "First test starts now. Start up that antique and show us what you can do." Harold approached his bike with the same confidence he'd shown during the war. His movements were deliberate as he checked the fuel line and primed the engine. The other bikers watched silently, some probably expecting him to fail. The Indian chief's engine roared to life on the first try, its sound different from the modern bikes, deeper, more powerful. Harold felt the familiar vibration through the handlebars and couldn't help but smile. Martha would have loved this moment. "Not bad," Snake admitted. "But starting it is one thing. Riding it is another. Follow us, if you can keep up." He nodded to his gang, and they headed toward their motorcycles. As the bikers mounted their machines, Harold adjusted his gloves and took a deep breath. He knew this was either the bravest or the most foolish thing he'd done in decades. But looking at the vandalized memorial, he also knew he had to try. "Well, Martha," he whispered, patting the bike's fuel tank, "let's show these youngsters how we did things in our day." The roar of motorcycles echoed through the streets as Harold followed Snake and his gang out of town. On his Indian chief, Harold kept pace steadily, despite Snake's attempts to lose him through complicated routes. Years might have passed, but Harold's hands remembered every subtle movement needed to control his bike. They arrived at an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of town. This was where the road warriors tested new members, though they'd never tested anyone quite like Harold before. "All right, old-timer," Snake called out, dismounting his bike. "First challenge. Let's see how you handle the slow race." Harold nodded, knowing exactly what this meant. In a slow race, the last rider to reach the finish line without putting their feet down wins. It was all about balance and control, skills he'd mastered during the war when he had to move silently through enemy territory. 5 bikers lined up, including Harold. Snake raised his arm. "Ready? Go." The motorcycles moved forward at a crawl. One by one, riders started putting their feet down to keep balance. Their heavy modern bikes weren't made for such slow movements. But Harold and his Indian chief moved like they were dancing to a slow song. His decades of experience showed in every subtle adjustment. "Look at that control," whispered the young biker called Rookie to his friends. Harold was the last one still riding, crossing the finish line without ever touching the ground. Snake frowned. "Lucky break. Next test. Figure 8s around these cones. Drop a cone or put your foot down, you're out." For the next hour, Snake threw increasingly difficult challenges at Harold. Tight turns, emergency stops, riding over obstacles. Tests designed to make him quit. But with each challenge, Harold showed not just skill, but a deep understanding of motorcycle handling that amazed even the most skeptical bikers. During a break, Harold sat on his bike, taking small sips from a water bottle. Rookie approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said, glancing back at his friends, "could you tell me about that photo again? The one from the war?" Harold smiled and pulled out the old photograph. Soon, other bikers gathered around as he pointed out different parts of his military motorcycle. "See this bag here?" Harold explained, pointing to the photo. That could carry messages that would save entire companies of soldiers. We had to ride through rain, mud, and sometimes even gunfire to deliver them. But weren't you scared? Another biker asked. Being brave isn't about not being scared, Harold replied. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway. Just like today, I haven't ridden like this in years, but this memorial needs protecting. Snake, who had been listening from a distance, walked over. One last test, old man. Follow me. They rode to a steep dirt trail leading up a hill. Harold recognized it. Locals called it Devil's Climb. Even experienced riders thought twice before attempting it. Up and down, Snake said simply. Don't crash. The other bikers watched nervously as Harold studied the trail. Many of them had failed this test themselves their first time. Harold took a deep breath and started up the hill. The Indian chief's engine roared as he carefully picked his line between rocks and ruts. Near the top, his front wheel hit a loose rock, but Harold compensated smoothly, something he'd learned doing hill climbs in France during the war. At the summit, he turned around and began the descent, controlling his speed with expert clutch control. When he reached the bottom, even Snake was nodding in approval. Not bad for an old-timer, Snake admitted. But why? Why go through all this just for that memorial? Harold switched off his engine and looked Snake straight in the eye. Because those names on that wall, they were my friends, my brothers. They never got to grow old like me. They never got to have families or ride motorcycles for fun. They gave everything so we could be free, even free to be a bit wild sometimes. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of distant traffic. Finally, Snake extended his hand. Welcome to the Road Warriors, old-timer, but you're going to need a proper biker name. Harold shook his hand firmly. I already have one, he said with a slight smile. During the war, they called me Silver Ghost, because no matter how hard the enemy tried, they could never catch me. For the first time that day, Snake's smile was genuine. Silver Ghost it is. 2 weeks after Harold, now known as Silver Ghost, joined the Road Warriors, the bikers gathered at their usual meeting spot. But this time it was different. Instead of the parking lot, they met in Harold's garage, which he had opened up specially for the occasion. All right, Silver Ghost, Snake said, settling onto an old wooden chair. You promised us some real war stories tonight. Let's hear what you got. Harold had prepared for this evening. On his workbench, he'd laid out old photographs, maps, and even his original military motorcycle manual. But what caught everyone's attention was a dusty wooden box he brought down from his attic. Before I open this, Harold said, his hand resting on the box, I want you all to understand something. These aren't just stories about motorcycles. These are stories about sacrifice, brotherhood, and courage. He opened the box carefully. Inside were his war medals, old papers, and a worn leather messenger bag with bullet holes in it. The bikers leaned forward, their usual tough expressions replaced with genuine curiosity. This bag, Harold said, lifting it out, saved my life in 1944. See these holes? German sniper. Missed me by inches. He passed the bag around, and the bikers handled it with unexpected gentleness. Rookie pointed to one of the medals. What's this one for, sir? That's the Silver Star, Harold explained. Got that for a mission behind enemy lines. Our troops were about to walk into an ambush, and I had to get the warning to them. Rode 40 miles through German-controlled territory at night. No lights, just me and my motorcycle. He spread out an old yellowed map on the workbench. Red lines marked his various messenger routes through France and Germany. The bikers gathered around, their eyes wide as Harold traced one particularly dangerous route with his finger. This one here, he continued, was called the Devil's Run. Most messengers wouldn't take it. Too many German patrols. But one night, we got word that 100 American soldiers were about to be surrounded. Someone had to warn them. Snake, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. Did you take that run? Harold nodded. Darkest night I'd ever seen. Rain so hard you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. But I knew those boys needed that message. Used every motorcycle trick I knew, sliding through mud, fording streams, even jumped a destroyed bridge. He pulled out another photograph. It showed a young Harold, covered in mud, standing next to his battered military motorcycle. Behind him were dozens of grateful soldiers. Made it just in time, he said softly. Those 100 men? They'd all made it home because that message got through. The garage fell silent. Even the toughest bikers seemed moved by the story. That's when I learned what motorcycles really meant, Harold continued. They're not just about making noise or showing off. They're about freedom, yes, but also responsibility. Every rider depends on their machine, and sometimes others depend on the rider. Snake picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully. My grandfather, he said suddenly, his voice different from his usual tough tone. He was in France during the war. Said a motorcycle messenger once saved his whole unit. Said the guy rode through hell to get them a warning message. Harold looked at the photo Snake was holding, then at Snake's face. What unit was your grandfather in? 101st Airborne, Charlie Company, Snake replied. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his old messenger log. He flipped through the pages until he found an entry from September 1944. Charlie Company, 101st Airborne. Message delivered 300 hours. German Panzer Division approaching from southeast. Snake's face went pale. That was you. Harold nodded slowly. All these years, I've wondered what happened to those men. Snake stood up abruptly, his tough guy image completely forgotten. Without a word, he walked over to Harold and wrapped him in a bear hug. My grandfather made it home because of you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You got to raise my dad who raised me, all because you rode through that night. The other bikers watched in amazement as their tough leader embraced the elderly veteran. In that moment, the gap between generations disappeared, and the true meaning of brotherhood, whether in war or on the open road, became clear to everyone in that garage. The Veterans Memorial Park looked very different 1 month after Harold became a member of the Road Warriors. On this sunny Saturday morning, instead of beer cans and cigarette butts, there were motorcycles lined up neatly along the parking area. Snake and his bikers weren't causing trouble anymore. They were cleaning. Hey, Silver Ghost, Rookie called out, holding up a paintbrush. Is this the right color for the flagpole? Harold walked over, his leather jacket now sporting both his World War II patch and the Road Warriors emblem. Perfect, he said, examining the patriotic blue paint. Martha would have loved seeing this. The transformation of the Road Warriors had surprised everyone in town. Mrs. Rodriguez nearly dropped her groceries when she first saw Snake carefully planting new flowers around the memorial. Tommy, the neighborhood kid, now sat fascinated as bikers helped Harold tell war stories, with Snake adding tales about his own grandfather. Silver Ghost, Snake said, approaching with a serious look on his face. The boys and I have been thinking. We want to do something special here. Harold listened as Snake explained their idea. The bikers wanted to start a program called Riders Remember, where motorcycle clubs from all over would help maintain veterans' memorials. They would also offer motorcycle escorts for military funerals and organize rides to raise money for veteran causes. That's quite a change from a month ago, Harold said with a smile. Snake looked embarrassed. Yeah, well, we were stupid before. Didn't understand what this place meant. But now, he gestured to where several bikers were helping old Joe Wilson set up chess tables near the memorial. Now we get it. Throughout the day, more bikers arrived from neighboring towns. Word had spread about the Road Warriors' transformation, and others wanted to be part of it. Harold watched as tough-looking bikers listened respectfully to veterans' stories, learned about military history, and volunteered to help with maintenance. Around noon, something unexpected happened. A black limousine pulled up, and the mayor stepped out, looking nervous. He'd come to investigate reports about bikers gathering at the memorial, but what he found left him speechless. Mr. Matthews, the mayor said, approaching Harold. I don't understand. Last month, we were getting complaints about vandalism. Now people are calling to praise these gentlemen? Harold chuckled. Sometimes, Mayor, people just need to learn the true meaning of respect and brotherhood. These boys aren't so different from the young soldiers I served with. They just needed a mission to believe in. The mayor watched as Snake organized a group to repaint the memorial's fence. Well, I never thought I'd say this, but would the Road Warriors be interested in helping with other community projects? Snake overheard this and walked over, wiping paint from his hands. Actually, sir, we got some ideas about that. Silver Ghost here has been teaching us about service to community. As the mayor and Snake discussed future projects, Harold sat on his favorite bench, taking it all in. The memorial had never looked better. Fresh flowers bloomed in perfectly maintained beds, the granite gleamed in the sunlight, and most importantly, other veterans were returning, no longer afraid to visit. Rookie brought Harold a cup of coffee and sat beside him. You know, Silver Ghost, my little brother's joining the military next month. I never understood why until now. Watching you, learning about what you did in the war, it changed how I see things. Harold nodded, remembering his own youth. That's how it works, son. One generation learns from another, and the chain of service continues. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, the bikers gathered around the memorial for a special ceremony. Snake had organized it as a surprise for Harold. One by one, members of the Road Warriors stepped forward, each laying a single rose at the base of the memorial. To honor those who served, Snake said solemnly, and to promise that their memory will be protected. Harold stood at attention, tears in his eyes, as these men, who just a month ago had been vandalizing this very spot, now showed such profound respect. His old military jacket felt a bit tighter around the shoulders, but his heart had never felt fuller. "You see, Martha?" he whispered, looking up at the evening sky. Sometimes the most unlikely people turn out to be the best guardians of memory. 1 year had passed since Harold Matthews first rode his Indian Chief motorcycle to confront the Road Warriors. On this bright Sunday morning, the Veterans Memorial Park was hosting its first annual Riders Remember gathering, and the scene was extraordinary. Hundreds of motorcycles lined the streets around the park. Bikers from clubs all across the country had come to see the place where the legendary Silver Ghost had changed a group of troublemakers into guardians of veterans' memories. The Road Warriors, with Snake leading them, directed parking and welcomed visitors with a pride no one would have believed possible a year ago. Harold sat on his customized bench, a gift from the bikers on his 94th birthday, watching it all with quiet satisfaction. His Indian chief, now restored to perfect condition by the Road Warriors' expert mechanics, stood on display near the memorial, surrounded by admiring riders. Silver Ghost. Tommy came running up, now wearing a Junior Road Warriors vest that Snake had specially made for the neighborhood kids. "Can you believe how many bikes are here? Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Harold smiled. Behind Tommy, Mrs. Rodriguez was serving coffee to visiting bikers from her new Memorial Park Cafe, another positive change that had come to the area. Snake approached, looking different from the rough character he'd been a year ago. He still wore his leather jacket, but now it also displayed a veteran support patch and an American flag. "Everything's ready for the ceremony, Silver Ghost," Snake reported. "All 50 chapters of the Riders Remember program are represented today." The program had spread far beyond their small town. What started with the Road Warriors had grown into a national movement of motorcycle clubs protecting and maintaining veterans' memorials. They'd even been featured in several newspapers and motorcycle magazines. As Harold stood to address the crowd, he remembered that first confrontation a year ago. Who could have guessed that his crazy decision would lead to this? The gathered bikers fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone. "My fellow riders and veterans," Harold began, his voice strong despite his age. "1 year ago, I thought I was fighting to protect this memorial. Instead, I found a new family and a new way to honor our fallen heroes." He gestured to where old Joe Wilson was teaching young bikers about military history. Near them, Rookie, now a military veteran himself after serving a tour, was showing his military photos to interested visitors. Looking around today, Harold continued, "I see the true spirit of America. It's not about age or appearance or even background. It's about coming together to remember and serve." Snake stepped forward then, unveiling a new addition to the memorial, a marble plaque that read, "Dedicated to Harold Silver Ghost Matthews, who taught us that it's never too late to become a hero." The crowd erupted in applause, but Harold wasn't finished. "Today, I'm proud to announce that the Road Warriors have raised enough money to create 10 new scholarships for veterans' children, and our Riders Remember chapters across the country have adopted over 200 memorials this year alone." More cheers followed, and Harold could see tears in some of the toughest-looking bikers' eyes. After the ceremony, as riders mingled and shared stories, a young woman approached Harold. She was wearing an Air Force uniform. Sir, she said, I'm Snake's daughter. I just wanted you to know that your story inspired me to enlist. That never talked about Grandpa's service until he met you. Now he never stops talking about it. Harold smiled, remembering the night Snake discovered their connection through his grandfather. Your father's a good man. He just needed to be reminded of his own heritage. As the day drew to a close, the bikers organized a special sunset ride around town. Harold led the parade on his Indian chief, with Snake and the road warriors right behind him. The rumble of hundreds of motorcycles filled the air, but this time it wasn't a disturbance. It was a tribute. Standing at the memorial after everyone had gone, Harold looked at the names of his old comrades. Well, boys, he said softly, I'd say the memorial is in good hands now. Who would have thought your best protection would come from the very people who once disrespected you? He touched the cool granite one last time before heading home. The evening light caught his road warrior's patch, now worn proudly next to his World War II insignia, two symbols of brotherhood separated by decades but united in purpose. As he rode home on his Indian chief, Harold Matthews, the Silver Ghost, knew that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to believe in the future, even if that future comes wearing leather jackets and riding motorcycles.